Our final keynote speaker this morning is Tarak Barkawi. Again, a great friend of the Institute, who's been here a number of times. Tarak is Associate Professor at the New School for Social Research in New York. He is a prolific author, has written a great deal on post-colonialism, on small wars, on the relationship between the developed North and the underdeveloped South. I guess, again, those categories are shifting. So, Tarak, over to you.
Thank you, Michael. Before beginning, let me recognize my collaborator, Dr. Shane Brighton of the University of Sussex, with whom the ideas I will share with you this morning have been developed. I've entitled my remarks, UK Grand Strategy, an Antiquated Kingdom Faces the 21st Century. I think it's for me to strike a contrary note up here. Ladies and gentlemen, we are at a much more dire and dangerous moment than we care to recognize. Over the last decade, at tremendous cost in money, other people's lives, and most of all, in reputation, the West has managed to put al-Qaeda and its affiliates on the back foot. But we have done so in a manner that has allowed us to retain our illusions about ourselves, about the world we live in, and about the coming century we face. There is now a gap of grand strategic significance between actually existing Britain, its power and place in the world, and the Britain the political class thinks it's governing. One indicator of this is that the Home Secretary thinks it's helpful for UK PLC to announce that Britain is historically a Christian country and that immigrants will be tested accordingly. There is also a gap of grand strategic significance between the traditions and history of the UK armed forces and their actual situation today, in terms not only of resources, but of the character and nature of the strategic problems they face in the world. The British Army risks being reduced to a self-defense militia, prevented from deploying abroad by the domestic politics of a new reserve system being imposed upon it. The RAF can barely handle a ramshackle desert kingdom without running out of munitions, pilots, and parts, and only then with the USAF flying all the support missions. And the Royal Navy has sacrificed much, the ability to keep a frigate off Somalia or one in the Caribbean, to build a tiny battle fleet that risks being as relevant to the conflicts it will face as the Imperial German Navy was in World War I. Yet the self-images, the worldviews, the traditions of Britain's military services are world-bestriding. The predecessors of officers serving today literally conquered the world, fought and won battles of great historical significance, commanded the mass forces of a first-rate power, and were responsible for the security and prosperity of the globe. Traditions are mutable. They can always be reimagined for new times, and I would never suggest to military service abandon them in their entirety. But strategy is not a tea party hosted by English heritage. The scales before our eyes need to be torn away and cherished illusions abandoned. What would a clear-eyed assessment of the UK's strategic situation in coming decades look like? What resources, hard and soft, can the UK draw upon to face the disordered, multipolar, and crisis-prone world of the 21st century? And what does military professionalism and honesty at all levels demand in these troubled, constrained times? The best strategy, Clausewitz remarked sardonically, is always to be very strong, first in general, and then at the decisive point. Because of his association with the West, with its great staff colleges, it is simply assumed that Clausewitz is the theorist of those who always can afford to be very strong. But in fact, he too was an officer in the armed forces of an antiquated kingdom. So take heart, ladies and gentlemen, and let the Prussian brigadier guide us anew. The kingdom of Prussia had resisted change, blinded by its own past glories, by out-of-date images of its own power and military prowess. Clausewitz was one of a group of reform-minded officers trying to save his country and his service by changing them. His superiors and the regime he served were committed to a mythology derived from Frederick the Great. This legacy legitimated the position of the Junker nobility and flattered the sensibilities of officers. What need have they of dangerously French notions like meritocracy? but it doomed Clausewitz, his soldiers, and his country to defeat at Jena Auerstadt. It was a preferred self-image that kept the Prussian regime from recognizing the real threat posed by revolutionary France, from recognizing its own backwardness and lack of relative modernity. This is nothing new. On the eve of being carved up by Europeans, Imperial China, the center of the known universe, imagined it was dealing with some far-off barbarians. Perhaps of more relevance here, in the 1990s, New Zealand was forced to recognize it was in fact a small country in the Asia-Pacific, not the North Atlantic, and that pith helmets and imperial attitudes were not a rational response to a rising Asia. Britain is in the North Atlantic, and today it is strung between the two great halves of a West in relative world decline. Much of UK grand strategic debate concerns which half the UK wants to decline with, the right preferring the US and the left preferring Europe. Both of these continental-sized powers are and will be facing internal and external challenges of their own with reduced resources. At some point in the near future, nearer than we may appreciate, a great contradiction in world politics will come into view. On the one hand, the image of the West as the provider of global order, as the ultimate arbiter of a rules-based order, as the force for good and universal values. On the other hand, the reality of a divided West in relative decline with severe domestic problems and broken governance in a world with rising Asian, Latin, and African powers with their own values, interests, and perspectives, and with relations amongst themselves. These powers will not achieve anything like the world hegemony maintained by the West from the 16th century. They will be crisis-ridden, divided, and in conflict. All will face the transnational challenges and dynamics of an interconnected world, a world in which Islamic militants, among others, practice a global politics that slice through nation-states, while global and local markets blow boom and bust, devastating ways of life. The world will be multipolar, transnational, and full of volatility, facing crises from environment to economy. The great contradiction of the first half of the 21st century will revolve around the core illusion of the West, that it is the provider of and responsible for world order, amid a reality of relative loss of power and lack of modernization. How this contradiction is managed, particularly by the United States, will shape the coming decades and determine questions of war, peace, and prosperity. We can all be forgiven for hanging on to this illusion. After all, the victorious order of battle of 1945 still sits atop the UN Security Council. We created the very institutions that govern the world. It was our expansion that gave birth to a world carved up in sovereign states and to the international economic relations that entangle them all. But this world is no longer ours to rule, or to be responsible for, or to develop, or to tell it what is wrong and what is right. That things are otherwise, that this is so and will remain so, is a mythical Western brew at least as heady as the Frederician legacy that Clausewitz confronted in his day. The U.S. can afford to buy pints of it for some time longer, not much longer. I would suggest the moment beyond which it is unwise for the U.K. to drink of these draughts has already passed. Perhaps it did so somewhere south of Baghdad, or was it in Helmandshire? What is demanded is a fundamental reassessment and change of mindset for the UK. That from being a major power responsible for global order to being a small power with global reach and global interests. A small power with global reach and its own global interests. Not only does this have the virtue of truth, but it is already to accentuate the positive and to move away from the Ruritanian dimensions of contemporary British self-image, with its Knights Commander of an empire that consists of an island chain of tax havens, some of which are threatening to secede. As a small power, the UK is unusually well endowed, with a large economy and a world-leading financial center, a Security Council seat, armed forces with a first-class reputation, diasporas and market links around the world, at home a multicultural, cosmopolitan population with connections everywhere. A worldwide reserve of nostalgia for an imagined imperial past of prosperity and right order, and in the BBC and World Service, a global soft power instrument of the first rank, with the kind of credibility the Chinese, among others, are trying but cannot buy. A UK government with any strategic sense at all would be investing heavily in these cheap but unparalleled global media access and reputation. It is the global non-Western dimensions and advantages of UK power that are the most crucial, because they offer escape from the declining halves of the West and access to the markets and economies that are actually growing in the world. And it is the Royal Navy that should be the premier service in unlocking the possibilities of this world policy. But in order to take advantage of its considerable endowments, a bold reimagining of UK national identity and of Britain's place in the world is necessary. In my remaining time, I'll say a little bit about this and some of its implications for the Navy. Another very important fact about the 21st century, to complement the statistics you've heard, is that coming to adulthood today around the world is a post-Hong Kong generation. People in both the West and elsewhere who are genuinely post-colonial. I do not mean this in the formal sense of decolonization, but rather that the harsh politics of empire in the mid-20th century are over. Today, the new generation in the West does not sit around and damn the natives for being impotent and lazy. And in Asia and Africa, after some decades of being ruled by their own bastards, they no longer blame the white man for every ill that befalls them. The receding of a conflicted imperial past has opened space for imperial nostalgia, and with it the idea of a global Britain that is potentially shared by all those who were touched by the British Empire at home and abroad. I don't want to overstate, but there are extraordinary possibilities for cultural influence and consequently for economic and strategic power. Whenever I write in Al Jazeera on these themes, I am deluged with email from brown people around the world who, while heartily against US-UK policy in Iraq and Afghanistan, think fondly of their connection to the idea of this country and its past world role. Before you dismiss me, remember that one of the great frustrations of recent decades is that folks like Al-Qaeda, radical environmentalists, humanitarians, and the human rights movements practice a global politics that regularly outmaneuver lumbering ships of state, cutting through sovereign borders to speak to people directly. Of course, there are exceptions, states who can do this, the world reach of Soviet communism in its day, and of the US as defender and promoter of democracy. And I've just suggested how Little Britain might begin to exercise some serious global cachet in this regard, articulating a politically attractive world vision of the kind that has eluded the West during the War on Terror. This potential, the idea of a Britain as a figuratively brown, multicultural, and global country cannot be unlocked when a prime minister stands with the Chancellor of Germany in Munich, of all places, to declare multiculturalism dead. In fact, in each of the moments of its greatest world power, Britain, historically a pagan country, has purveyed a vision of multiculturalism appropriate to the age. In the 17th and 18th centuries, brown and black people facing exploitation in English possessions around the world appealed to the crown in the name of their rights as free-born Englishmen. African slaves struggling in Caribbean sugar plantations and English peasants facing enclosure in the home counties could invoke an identity with global reach, as odd as it sounds to our ears. At the height of empire, this became white man's burden, connecting the fates of white and dark peoples. And when, in the post-war era, the UK needed labor, a vision arose of the UK as home to immigrant communities where one could live among one's own kind. What now will be our new multicultural vision to accompany UK grand strategy in a global era? One of the great advantages of imperial multiculturalism was the ability, first through colonial militaries and later through mechanisms of advice and support, what you now call engagement, to raise, train, and influence other people's armed forces and help them do our bidding, or at least work in our interests. A global advisory presence ought to be redoubled as a principal task of UK armed forces, as the tip of the spear for UK PLC, as a site of influence on the most crucial institution of state the world over, and in order to bring to the table, in military crises, the advised and supported forces of other countries. How might a battle fleet help in this role? What new and cheap areas of expertise, training, and defense export might be developed? Riverine operations, for example. I would ask the officers of the Royal Navy here today whether their service, with the lowest ethnic minority representation of any of the UK armed forces, is ready to play its global role. Last I checked, only 3.5% of other ranks and a shocking 1.8% of the Navy's officer corps are minorities, who number 10% of the UK's population. An entering class at Dartmouth in recent years commented that their cohort did not reflect the Britain they knew. I hope you can deduce from my talk that recruiting minorities is not about pleasing liberals or the European Court of Human Rights or about being hospitable to immigrants, but about activating a strategic resource. British Asian, British African officers are embodiments of the global Britain of which I have been speaking. If this sounds alien to you, I suggest you go up the road and look at Nelson's column, where you will see representations of some of the 71 foreigners aboard HMS Victory at Trafalgar, including Africans and West Indians. Or consult your history books, where you will discover that Africans made up 25% of the Royal Navy's manpower in the 18th century. These are some usable traditions of your service for the 21st century. And if you think I'm only talking about soft power and glossy magazines with black faces on the front cover, let me leave you with this moment on the bridge of the USS Kidd last January. An Iranian fishing vessel had been hijacked by Somali pirates. The Iranian crew was from a region of Iran where Urdu is spoken. Some days before, a French warship had come alongside the hijacked Iranian ship, inquiring in English and Arabic if anything was amiss, languages the Somali pirates understood. The Iranian captain can only say to the French, all was well. When it came turn of the USS Kidd, the captain called to the bridge crew members who spoke different languages. One of them, Chief Petty Officer Jagdeep Sidhu, heard the Iranian captain use an Urdu phrase. Someone put the cultural pieces together, and the Americans were able to communicate secretly with the Iranian captain, retaking the ship without a shot being fired or a life lost. A few days prior to this incident, the Stennis battle group of which the Kidd was a part had been told by the Iranian government not to return to the Persian Gulf. Freeing the Iranian vessel from pirates amounted to a diplomatic coup, an embarrassment for Iran, and created enduring appreciation from an Iranian fishing community for saving their husbands, sons, and brothers, perhaps to be leveraged later. How many South Asian CPOs serve on your ships? Or are there a greater percentage relative to population serving in the U.S. Navy? And how many of your watch officers know that there are parts of Iran where Urdu is the primary language? These are the kinds of questions upon which naval operations may turn in the 21st century. Thank you.
Tarak. Thank you. Tarak, thank you very much. I don't know why you sugar the pill. You should just give it to us straight. Anyway, that was very good. We now are off the record, or that was on the record, astonishingly. And we're now off the record until the end of this session. We've got about 20 minutes for questions and comments. You will...